Justin Ford for From the Frontline. In tonight's episode, we will be celebrating Rhodesia's remarkable heritage that has impacted the world. In the studio with me is Dr. Peter Hammond, the founder of Frontline Fellowship, who has been involved in serving persecuted Christians for over 40 years in 38 countries. Dr. Hammond, this last weekend you conducted the remembrance service for the Rhodesia Association of South Africa. During the sermon you made some remarkable statements declaring that the heritage of Rhodesia has impacted the world. Can you please explain in what way Rhodesia has blessed and benefited the world?
Well, yes, certainly. Rhodesia was on the very front line of the Cold War, on the hot parts of the Cold War, and resisting communist aggression, because behind the ZANU terrorists of Robert Mugabe attacking Rhodesia was Red China. Behind the ZAPU terrorists who were attacking Rhodesia, the Zimbabwe African People's Union of Joshua Nkomo was the Soviet Union. So they were using Warsaw Pact weapons, they were using Soviet training, and of course the AK-47, the RPG, the PKM, the Strela heat-seeking missiles that took out our civilian airliners, and all of these weapons came from the Soviet Union, and Rhodesia was fighting a hot war during what is called the Cold War. And I remember when the Cold War ended in 1989, Newsweek magazine made the imbecilic statement, the Cold War was a war in which no bullets were fired and no one died. Like, do they not know about the Korean War? Did they not know about the Vietnam War? Did they not know about the Rhodesian War? Well, evidently not, or the war in Angola. There were a lot of hot parts of the Cold War, and to make such a stupid statement as no one died during the Cold War, even considering the millions of Christians who were dying in communist concentration camps at the same time, the spies who were being captured, murdered, put before firing squads, you can't say no one died in the Cold War. That's such a stupid statement, but that's the level of journalism Newspeak, Useless News and World Report, and Sly magazine dished up. Well, Rhodesia did make a major impact because, sometimes small groups of people have won wars even while losing the battle. So, for example, you just think of the impact of the 300 Spartans. There they were at Thermopylae, and the 300 Spartans were fighting against millions of Persians. Not that at the Battle of Thermopylae, not that they could all be deployed at the same time, because the Spartans under King Leonidas, which basically means lion, King Leonidas was blocking the Persians at the very narrow pass of Thermopylae, so very strategically chosen location. But although all 300 Spartans died and the Persians could say they won that battle, they lost the war because the Spartans delayed them so much it gave the rest of the Greeks time to rally to prevent this invasion of Europe. If the 300 Spartans hadn't made that sacrifice at Thermopylae, Europe could have become Asian under the Persians and so on, who were invading at that time. So that sacrifice was critical. And I think all Texans know that the sacrifice of the men who fought at the Alamo, although they lost, although they were all wiped out, there were no survivors at the Battle of the Alamo, yet they held up this massive Mexican army of Santa Anna, enabling Texas to rally. And when the Texans speak about remember the Alamo, they remember a battle that was lost, but which won the war. And we can also think of the Knights of Malta, 700 knights versus 40,000 Turks. And at this 4-month siege of Malta, the knights, not one escaped unscathed. Many died, the rest were wounded, but they succeeded in defeating the Turks and saving Europe from invasion. And I think in a real sense, people look back and say, the victory of the Cold War, the fact that we were able to defeat the Soviet Union, bring down the Berlin Wall, see a collapse of the Iron Curtain, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, was to a large extent made possible because Rhodesia held the line for 15 incredible years, holding the line until some real decent leaders could come to power, like Margaret Thatcher in Britain, Ronald Reagan in America, P.W. Bush in South Africa, and they collectively won the Cold War. But there would have been no Cold War to win if Rhodesia hadn't made that stand, that incredible, tenacious stand, fighting ferociously for 15 years, and that bought time for the West to ultimately win the Cold War. So that's just one major way in which Rhodesia's heritage has impacted the world, but there are others as well.
Rhodesia was certainly on the very front line of the Cold War, resisting communist aggression. The courageous resistance of the Rhodesian forces most certainly won time. That enabled the West to win the Cold War, as you said, and see the collapse of the Soviet Union. Can you point out other ways in which Rhodesia has made a worldwide impact?
Well, yes, consider the fact that Rhodesia's got one of the greatest game reserves in the world, Wankie Game Reserve, which I've had the privilege of going to many times. Victoria Falls, of course, one of the 7 natural wonders of the world, was part of our country. And Victoria Falls, by the way, is twice the height of Niagara Falls, which is the biggest in America. It's twice as wide as the Horseshoe Falls, which is the biggest one in South America. During the rainy season, it can increase to up to over 1 million tons of water falling over the falls in a second. 1 million tons a second. I mean, just think of that. The phenomenal power. I've been to Victoria Falls sometimes during the rainy season when I've been soaked to the skin just from the spray, even down to the socks and my boots, everything soaked. If I jumped in the Zambezi River, I wouldn't have gotten any wetter. And that's just the force of the spray. You can hardly imagine the power of Victoria Falls, which has been a phenomenal inspiration throughout the world. But there's also a whole lot of characters in films and books which are based on key Rhodesian people. And I'll point that out in a moment as we go through some of those. But, for example, those people like Wilbur Smith. Wilbur Smith based his key character, Courtney, on Frederick Courtney Selous. And Frederick Courtney Selous was the English-born hunter par excellence, the greatest scout of all times. He inspired the creation of the Selous Scouts, but Wilbur Smith created his Courtney character on Frederick Selous. In fact, Sir Rider Haggard, who wrote King Solomon's Mines and Alan Quatermain, he based his Alan Quatermain character on Frederick Selous, who was one of the handpicked key people that Cecil Rhodes used as the scout. I mean, he is like the greatest scout. And that's why Rhodesia's premier elite fighting force was called the Selous Scouts. Interestingly enough, Frederick Courtney Selous volunteered to join up with the British forces in World War I, and the recruiting officers just shook their head and turned him down. He was 62 years old. You're too old to fight in the war. But later on, after the German forces in German East Africa under General von Letlow-Vorbeck had whipped the British and chased them round and round the mulberry bush, and even had sent out Jan Smuts, hoping that the Boer commandos who'd given the British so much grief during the Anglo-Boer War, well, they'd be able to handle General von Letlow-Vorbeck. Well, they didn't manage either. So before you knew it, Frederick Courtney Selous was being chased up, and the War Office called him up and asked him to serve in East Africa, helping their forces who were woefully inadequate in handling the guerrilla warfare of the German Schutztruppe and Askari under General von Letlow-Vorbeck. He is commissioned as a lieutenant and sent off there. Interestingly enough, that was to be his last mission, because at a skirmish in the Rufiji River, he was shot in the head through a stray bullet. And he was actually buried there, and they've named a game reserve in the area after him. But he was buried in the wilderness right by a massive tree, which now is part of a wonderful game reserve in Uganda as part of the East African campaign. But there's Frederick Selous, who's the inspiration for Sir Rider Haggard's Alan Quatermain, the inspiration for the Wilbur Smith novels, and he's just the greatest shot hunter. The Madabili said elephants can't even kill him, and he was counted as such a hero. President Theodore Roosevelt in America named him as one of the greatest men he ever met, and the German Kaiser Wilhelm II lifted him up before the youth of Germany as the example of the kind of man they should aspire to be. So, I mean, there is a lot of inspiration that went around the world just from one of the scouts in Rhodesia, Frederick Selous. But what a great game reserve we've got in Wankie. What a phenomenal waterfall we've got in Victoria Falls. The greatest. You can't find a better waterfall anywhere in the world.
Rhodesia as you've alluded to, has had some extraordinary personalities involved in its history and founding. Please tell us more about the impact of Dr. David Livingstone and his connection with Rhodesia.
Yes, well, Dr. David Livingstone was the first Christian to proclaim the gospel in what today is Zimbabwe, what later became Rhodesia. And David Livingstone will always be associated with Victoria Falls. 170 years ago, on the 16th of November, 1855, David Livingstone sighted Victoria Falls. Now, he first asked, what's this massive mist in the distance? He first thought it was a Phelps fire. There's this mist rising miles high in the sky, or smoke. He thought it was smoke at first. And the local people said, Musi Oyatanya, the smoke that thunders. What makes the smoke thunder? Spirits, evil spirits. So, have you been there? And the local tribesmen said, no, it's haunted. I can't go there. They're too terrified. The thunder of the waterfall is so loud, it can be heard from far away, and people are too scared to go there. And so David Livingstone borrowed a canoe. Well, when you say borrowed, had to rent the canoe. Everything cost. He had to pay a fortune for everything. The local tribes didn't lend anything. But so he rows down towards Victoria Falls, which is quite a dangerous thing to do. He must have known he was heading towards a waterfall as he got closer. The thunder, the noise, and the water's going fast and fast. The water's getting whiter and whiter because it's going over rocks. And he beached on what we today call Livingston Island. Now, good thing he did, because if he went any further, we wouldn't have heard of him anymore. Interestingly, the first time I saw Victoria Falls, I was 12 years old, and everyone was talking about an American film crew had just gone over Devil's Cataract, which is one of the first of the cataracts at Victoria Falls. And the director, the producer of the film, cameraman, they were all in this boat, and they got too close to the edge, and it just sucked them over. They must have got some phenomenal photography on the way down, but it's just all lost. It's a long way down. And, well, David Livingstone crawled to the edge of Livingston Island, and he was prepared. He had a rope with a weighted metal on the end, and he let it down. He measured out 310 feet. We've got his sketches here at Livingston House, because we've got an original edition of Livingstone's Travels where he actually puts his sketches in, which even has his handwriting notes, and I've published it. It's part of our presentation of David Livingstone. 310 feet high. That's what it is. Even our measurements today can't improve on it. And then he worked out the distance across the falls, 1,860 yards, which is accurate. That's what it is. You can't improve on it. Now, how did he measure that? You can't pace it out. I mean, there's a waterfall, for goodness sakes. When I was a child, my mother said I tried to walk across the waterfall and just, of course, got washed over the edge. And she said that God must have special angels assigned just to keep boys alive to adulthood. And yes, you can't walk across a waterfall, but somehow David Livingstone not only paced out the Victoria Falls, he did sketches. And his sketches are also in his first edition of Livingstone's Travels. And, it's hard enough to sketch what's there, but he sketched what he couldn't see. He sort of elevated himself to a position where if there was a mound or a hill or a high point, to show the depth and to show the different gorges. And there is no hill from which you could do it. You can't get that perspective unless you've got a drone today or you go in a helicopter. But David Livingstone sketched the falls sort of in 3 dimensions so that you could get a feel of the depth that you talk about, which is an amazing accomplishment for any artist. And some people have scorned the fact that David Livingstone discovered Victoria Falls. Of course he didn't discover Victoria Falls. All the local people knew about it. Well, maybe not. Because even 10 years later, when he went with Thomas Baines, the greatest artist of the Victorian era, Queen Victoria dispatched the top oil on canvas painting artist on Livingstone's second great missionary journey to sketch the falls named after her. As David Livingstone said, angels in flight must have gazed on such sights at creation, the most amazing sights he saw in his whole life. And even when Thomas Baines went there, he painted phenomenal, intense herds of buffalo and the greatest concentration of wildlife Livingstone saw anywhere in Africa. And remember, David Livingstone walked across Africa 26 years. He walked from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. He walked from Cape Town all the way up to what today is the Congo and Tanzania, Burundi. So in all those years, he never saw more wildlife concentrated in one place than at what we today call Victoria Falls. It was obviously a nature sanctuary because the local people didn't go hunting there. They were too scared to approach it, so the animals realized this is a place where you can be free of hunters. And that's why there was such a lot of wildlife, of course, a lot of vegetation too, because of the phenomenal amounts of water and spray. So it's a beautiful, like, tropical jungle. Not just a tropical jungle, it's like a rainforest. And an amazing place to go. So David Livingstone is certainly the first one to have made it known. He might have been the first one to be there. There's one painting of David Livingstone, or sketching of him crawling to the edge of Livingstone Island and to the edge so that he could send a weighted line down and see how tall it was. But in this, they've got two Madibili standing with spears in the background, which is pure imagination. There was no one with him. No one was willing to take the risk to go near this Musi or Tanya, the smoke that thunders at that time. David Livingstone is certainly the first to have named it, to have mapped it, to have sketched it, and the first to have made it known to the world. And so on the anniversary, the centenary of the discovery of Victoria Falls, on the Rhodesian side of the Zambezi River, they erected the iconic statue to David Livingstone, which I think many people have seen. It's our model, our logo for David Livingstone and Livingstone Fellowship. And at Livingstone House, our Livingstone window has that iconic outline of David Livingstone. Well, that's the statue that the Rhodesians built and put on the Rhodesian side. Now, interesting, the statues to Cecil John Rhodes in what today is Zimbabwe have all been taken down. But nobody's dared touch the statues to David Livingstone. In fact, on the Zambian side, I counted 11 monuments to David Livingstone, just in the town of Livingstone on the Zambian side, back in 2013 when we were celebrating the 200th anniversary of David Livingstone, the Livingstone 200, which was covered by national TV, and there were international guests. It was a big event. We kind of followed the footsteps of David Livingstone on the 200th anniversary of his birth, and we went across 12 vast countries. Although we did cheat, we drove. As I've said to our field workers who complained about the bad roads, I said, we drive where David Livingstone walked. And we drive across bridges that didn't exist when David Livingstone came here, on roads that didn't exist either. And we have bottled water and purified water purification systems, which he didn't have. David Livingstone said that he drank water thick with rhinoceros urine and putrid with buffalo dung. He endured malaria and all these other things multiple times over. So David Livingstone is a great missionary and explorer whose name's forever connected with Rhodesia, where his most iconic statue is. And, of course, the Victoria Falls that he mapped and named and made known to the world is a major part, an iconic part of Rhodesia. And I think it's in the worldwide international consciousness as a result.
What can you tell us about the founder after whom the country is named, Cecil John Rhodes?
Yes, Rhodesia is named after Rhodes. As many people have said, the first name in Rhodesian is Rhodes, but the last word in Rhodesian is Ian. Ian Smith was the founder, was the last Prime Minister of Rhodesia. Cecil John Rhodes was the founder. Well, without Cecil John Rhodes, there wouldn't have been a Rhodesia. And Cecil John Rhodes is the son of a pastor, Church of England pastor from Britain, and he was a sickly child and was expected to not live very long and to die soon. So they sent him out to a warm climate, Natal actually, hoping that that would be better for his tuberculosis in his lungs, which it was. But then diamonds were discovered shortly after he arrived in Natal. So he ditched the farming, went to the mines, and was such an innovator. He saw there's so many diamonds, and diamonds are so common. Diamonds are going to become worthless. So he's the one who came up with the idea of we've got to consolidate, hence the consolidated mines. Because if we don't create a monopoly and make diamonds scarce, they won't be worth that much at all, because actually there's a lot of diamonds. There's whole huge areas of coastlands in Southwest Africa and Namibia which are prohibited for anyone to go near because there's diamonds just lying on the ground. People find diamonds in the Orange River because Kimberley is right at a source of the Orange River, and this huge column of it's like a volcano of diamonds inside. A lot of these diamonds have gone down the Orange River, and some have ended up in the Atlantic Ocean. And scuba divers are finding diamonds to this day. I know some people who do scuba diving for a living, getting diamonds from the mouth of the Orange River, for example. Well, it's Cecil Rhodes who saw the need to get a monopoly of diamonds and then to limit its access to the markets so that you can keep the prices high. You know, so it can cost you a month's wages to buy the engagement ring for your beloved and so on. And so Cecil Rhodes became very, very wealthy by his foresight and his innovation, and he saw the need. And by the way, Cecil Rhodes was famous for being the best boss on Kimberley mines. He not only learned the local Zulu language, well, it was local to Natal where he first came into the Matabele, so he could speak to the people in their language, many of the mine workers, but he paid them ahead. He didn't pay them at the end of the month, he paid them at the beginning of the month. And this was so innovative, and all the people said, you're stupid, you're just going to lose your workers and no one's going to work for you. And the opposite happened. So Cecil Rhodes was very advanced, very thoughtful. He was a good judge of character. He lived a very simple, humble life. He became one of the richest people in the world. And, you know, to see his cottage, which is in Cape Town, very humble little thatched roof cottage, not very impressive at all. And he was heir to a massive fortune, but he lived probably a simpler life. A lot of the time that he went to Rhodesia, he was camping on the side of the big wagon that the oxen were pulling. So he lived a very simple life. In fact, the average secretary in his company would have lived a higher lifestyle than he did. So Cecil Rhodes is a bit of a bundle of contradictions in many different strange ways. But I don't know anyone who did more for the people of the Cape than Cecil John Rhodes. He was Prime Minister of the Cape for a while, and during his tenure, he never took a salary. He didn't take a pound or a penny out of the public treasury. In fact, he didn't just work for free, which I don't think we've seen since then till Donald Trump, but he bought up a beautiful estate and built a magnificent house called Rhodesia, which is in a Cape Dutch style, and donated it to people of the Cape for any future Prime Minister. And that is the Prime Minister's residence, and it was the President's residence in the days of, for example, P.W. Botha, the last real president that we had in South Africa, certainly the last Christian president who called for national days of prayer and repentance. But Cecil Rhodes donated the Rhodesia estate to the people of the Cape. He also was a conservationist, and he saw the potential of Newlands Forest. He bought up all the slopes of Table Mountain, Devil's Peak, Newlands Forest, and donated it to the people of the Cape, make it a nature reserve so that no future logging could be done, no more homes, buildings. And if he hadn't, it would probably look like Rio de Janeiro, where the slopes of the mountains around Rio are all shanty towns and, stripped of forest. And it would be high-rise buildings today, but he's kept it in perpetuity as a gift to the people of the Cape. And anyone with dogs and anyone with grandchildren who likes hiking in Newlands Forest must be very grateful to Cecil Rhodes for that. He also donated Kirstenbosch Gardens, which is the biggest biodiversity nature botanical gardens in the world. Even when I was in England and I met someone from Kew, and when I said, Kew, do you work for MI6? He said, no, Kew Gardens. Kew Gardens is the epicenter of botanical work. And when he heard us from Cape Town, have you been to Kirstenbosch? And his eyes sort of got all misty as Kirstenbosch, like El Dorado. And I said, oh, I go there often. And you could just see the envy on him that, oh, you live so close to Kirstenbosch. Kirstenbosch has 2,800 botanical species. It's the richest piece of biodiversity on the planet. And that was a gift of Cecil Rhodes to the people of South Africa. University of Cape Town, which was modelled on Oxford University, has got to be the most beautiful university campus on the planet, certainly with the most spectacular view. And, that was also a gift from Cecil Rhodes. So Cecil Rhodes did a lot of good for the Cape, And that's why we've got his most prominent monument is in the Cape, Rhodes Memorial, which is a phenomenal memorial, so inspiringly well built that for the film on the life of Christ, the Matthew film, they used Rhodes Memorial as the site for the temple. And there was a lot of the film was actually filmed in and around, because it's got these very impressive pillars, and it's built like a temple in so many ways. So very impressive how they even used it for Herod's palace with some creative, some screening and some red curtains and so on. But in the Book of Acts, which is also a Christian film, they used that also as the venue. But anyway, so Cecil Rhodes did a lot for South Africa, did a lot for Rhodesia. At one point, there was this ruinous Matabele War of 1896, and Cecil Rhodes walked unarmed into the camp of the Matabele, with whom his British South Africa police were at war. And he refused an escort. He refused to even take a pistol, not a weapon at all. And by force of his personality, by just his charisma and his charm, he talked the mighty Matabele warriors into laying down their arms and to peace. To such an extent that when the king of the Matabele, Lubunkula, died, his sons, the princes, voluntarily joined the household of Cecil Rhodes, said, "You are now our father, you are now our king." And they served him to the end of his life, the princes of the Matabele. And when Cecil Rhodes passed away in Cape Town, tuberculosis, in Muizenberg, at what today we call Rhodes Cottage and Rhodes Museum, he was transported back to Matabele Land to be buried at World's View in the Matabele Land mountains. And he was given a king's burial. The Matabele gave him the royal salute that's never been given to any but a Zulu or Matabele king, Bayete. And they had, for 80 years, Matabele warriors were stationed 24 hours a day, stationed to guard the tomb of Cecil Rhodes and make sure people acted respectfully in that location. And when the Zimbabwe government tried to remove the tomb of Cecil Rhodes, the local chief forbade it. And in fact, even the Chief Justice stepped in, and the head of archaeology in Zimbabwe said, "No, you can't do that. And this is a tourist attraction, and this man is a mighty king." He is recognized as a king of the Matabele. The Matabele themselves saw him as one of their last kings. So Cecil Rhodes was an amazing, amazing person, an extraordinary person. And one mustn't neglect talking about his Rhodes scholarships. He saw the need of to prevent future wars. He wanted to get the greatest nations on earth, Germany, Britain, and America, interconnected with scholarships. He said these great nations must never fight one another. And so he wanted the Germans and the British to become such good friends by exchange of students. And so he had a section where the Kaiser would select students for Rhodes Scholars each year, where Britain would select students, America would, and so would Rhodesia and South Africa. And so the Rhodes Scholarships started with a vision. I think later the Germans got excluded because of British prejudice. But initially his idea was Britain and Germany must be friends. And the Kaiser respected Cecil Rhodes tremendously and said, if I had ministers like this, what couldn't I accomplish? And he was certainly a phenomenal man. Cecil Rhodes was commended by Queen Victoria that he added more to her empire than anyone else. And Cecil Rhodes was doubtless a schemer. I'm not saying he's necessarily a good man, but he was certainly a great man. And he benefited the people of the Cape no end. The Matabele loved and respected him greatly. I mean, some said he is their greatest king. And his Rhodes Scholarship did so much good that even an enemy like Nelson Mandela said that all of his education, primary, secondary, and tertiary, he owed to Cecil John Rhodes. Cecil John Rhodes' scholarship and his investment in education made possible all the education Nelson Mandela and so many others got. But I think Mandela's one of the only ones who actually thanked him and acknowledged it publicly. So he was an amazing person. But I shouldn't leave Cecil Rhodes without mentioning his right-hand man, Leander Starr Jameson. Now, Leander Starr Jameson was the first governor, the first magistrate of Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia as it was called actually. We only became Rhodesia later when Northern Rhodesia became Zambia. So for many years it was southern Rhodesia, and Leander Starr Jamison was Cecil Rhodes's hitman. He would do what Rhodes wanted. He's a medical doctor. But he left that all because Cecil Rhodes paid better. And Leander Starr Jamison led the Rhodesians in the 1893 war against the Matabele. He did a lot of amazing things. He of course, was involved in the notorious Jamison raid on the Transvaal, which was a catastrophe. But Leander Starr Jamison was the inspiration for Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, If you can keep your mind while all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. Absolutely the man who inspired If. So Rudyard Kipling said Leander Starr Jamison was his inspiration for this ultimate depiction of a real man. And that's an amazing accomplishment. The main hall in University of Cape Town is the Jamison Hall, although I'm sure they've tried to rename it now, but it's always Jamison Hall to us. And the steps leading up to it are the Jamison steps. So, and even the shuttle that drives students to the university campus in Cape Town is called the Jamie Shuttle. So there's a lot of inspiration. You could say that Cape Town and Kimberley and Bulawayo are linked because of Cecil John Rhodes. And what a phenomenal heritage. He was everything. When I was growing up in Rhodesia, Cecil Rhodes was legendary. But in the Cape he is too, and in Kimberley as well. So Cecil Rhodes is an inspiration. He could have taken his diamonds and put it all into personal wealth and luxury for himself. Instead, he lived in a very humble cottage, and he camped in the bush a lot. He was on the move continually. But he invested in education for the future generations. He invested in the country Rhodesia, and he invested in the people of the Cape. And we all benefit from Kirstenbosch Gardens and Newlands Forest, and we can praise God for University of Cape Town, even if it's fallen to bad hands these days, but it certainly looks a beautiful campus. I've even seen Jamison Steps and Jamison Hall turning up in foreign films. I saw a film on the Lusitania some time ago, a German-made film, and when it said, the Admiralty, London, I could see, that's Jamison Steps. And so it's become a place even for film shoots in South Africa for foreign events.
Now we turn to Major Alan Wilson, who was an inspiring pioneer in the early history of Rhodesia. Can you tell us more about Alan Wilson?
Yes, in fact, the junior school I went to in Rhodesia was Alan Wilson on Alan Wilson Street. Alan Wilson was an inspiring character in the pioneering of Rhodesia. Interestingly enough, he was a teetotaler and led the Temperance Society in Fort Victoria, which, considering how so many Rhodesians think you've got to be a boozer to be a Rhodesian, I've even been told being a teetotaler, I'm not a real Rhodesian. And, I'm chaplain for the Rhodesia Association, but many were not impressed with the fact that if you don't drink, you can't be Rhodesian. Well, Major Alan Wilson was a teetotaler. He led the Shangani Patrol, just 40 men who, in pursuit of Lubengula, came into a big clash with, they tried to end the war early by catching the king, to pursue the king of the lost king of the Matabele. But instead they found themselves trapped, surrounded by over 4,000 Matabele warriors. Massive impis. Now bear in mind the Matabele were Zulus who had defected and fled away from the wrath of King Shaka. And who knows what could have happened to them, but they became a major force in what later became Rhodesia. And so there was Alan Wilson's 40 men, and they were trapped across the flooded Shangani River, surrounded by these Matabele warriors. And they fought long and hard. It was a terrible battle on the 4th of December 1893, and the Shangani Patrol was all wiped out. As if you go to the World's View, by order of Cecil Rhodes, all the bodies of the Shangani Patrol were brought to World's View, and they've got a massive tomb, much bigger than the one of Cecil Rhodes, and it's got a simple statement there were no survivors. These men died to the last man, and they were given a chance to flee. At one point, the Induna Mjan saluted. There was silence, and the fighting stopped, and he said, "You are brave men. You may take your wounded, take your rifles, and you can leave." we salute you. And Alan Wilson responded, white men do not retreat. So Mjan saluted them again. The battle continued until the Shangani patrol had run out of ammunition, and then Mjan later testified, the white men sang. In fact, that's the title of one of the books on Shangani patrol. And from later, some of the Madabili veterans who were at the battle said they recognized later that they sang the British national anthem, God Save the Queen. They sang God Save the Queen. They then prayed the Lord's Prayer, again recognized by some of the Madabili survivors later, that when they became Christians, they recognized. They prayed the Lord's Prayer. They shook hands with one another. There were only a few men left by then. And they died to the last man. So Jameson hears about this, and he's packing up all the force at Bulawayo. They're getting ready to flee. And in come the Madabili warriors, led by their general, the Nduna Mjan. And Jameson said, well, why are you surrendering? You just won a victory. And the Nduna said, they were men of men, and their fathers were men before them. They fought like lions. We want to surrender before their fathers come for revenge. So they lost the battle, but they won the war. It might be the only case I can think of a defeat that won the war. Although I did mention before Thermopylae, there was a defeat which actually won the war. I mentioned the Alamo, there was a defeat that actually won the war. So here's a case in Rhodesia that the Shangani patrol made a terrible sacrifice. 40 men wiped out, fighting against all odds. And they ended up fighting literally with just their daggers. They'd run out of ammunition, but they fought to the last man. And they won the war. And I think to a large extent you could say that's the story of Rhodesia. Rhodesia may have lost the battle, but it helped win the war, the Cold War. It contributed to the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Iron Curtain, the defeat of the Warsaw Pact. It led to the opening up of Eastern Europe to the gospel. So Rhodesia's battle was not insignificant, and neither was the Shangani patrol. And so Major Alan Wilson was a tremendous inspiration. And I think he is lifted up in Rhodesia. When we were at school, he was the example.
You already mentioned Frederick Selous as an inspiring character.
Yes, Frederick Courtney Selous.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you give us more details about his background?
Well, interestingly enough, he came to Africa when he was just 18 years old. He came from England, but he became the greatest hunter, the greatest pioneer. He also is the one who made known to the world the Zimbabwe ruins. And his assumption was, when he found Zimbabwe ruins, he had found King Solomon's mines, which inspired the book King Solomon's Mines by Sir Rider Haggard, who also wrote She. And Sir Rider Haggard was quite a character too. But as Sir Rider Haggard said, he based his Alan Quatermain character on Frederick Courtney Selous, just as Wilbur Smith based his Courtney character on Frederick Selous. So he is an amazing person. It turned out he was probably wrong about Zimbabwe ruins being King Solomon's mines, but was a very inspiring Arabian type of structure in the middle of the jungles of Africa. And he didn't want to be part of Cecil Rhodes' campaigns, but he was talked into it. Cecil Rhodes had a way of making an offer that no one could refuse. He even brought up his enemies while I'm mentioning the fact that he managed to get Selous, after Selous turned down several times, to go and lead as a scout for his pioneer column. It's also interesting to notice that Cape Town used to have another university called University of the Cape of Good Hope. And Cecil Rhodes bought up the University of Good Hope and amalgamated with his University of Cape Town, which is why our University of Cape Town has so many magnificent old buildings in the centre of Cape Town and by the gardens, because they inherited all of the Good Hope University buildings, which went defunct because it had been superseded by the University of Cape Town. But yes, so Frederick Selous is quite a character.
Frederick Byrne was an American who was involved in the development of Rhodesia. What can you tell us about him?
Well, he's an amazing person. He's actually a Californian, famous as an Indian scout during the Indian Wars in America. Well, he came out and was recruited by Cecil Rhodes to be part of his pioneer column. And he was a key part of the pursuit column that was trying to chase after King Lobengula and end the Madabidi War in 1893. So he's initially part of the Shangani Patrol, and when the Shangani Patrol got cut off by the Swollen River, he was ordered by Major Alan Wilson to, along with Ingram, who was another American Indian scout, to swim the river and try and bring back Maxim Gunn and the rest of the column to help them. And so Frederick Burnham became an amazing life. He is the one American who won great awards fighting for the British in the First World War. Can't believe how many medals he had on him. The thing that I think Frederick Burnham also married the fiancée of Alan Wilson, which is another story. Gee, can you imagine? But Frederick Burnham was the inspiration for Baden-Powell. Major Baden-Powell, who founded the Boy Scouts movement, said that he got the idea for the Boy Scouts work in Rhodesia with the pioneer columns. And the first Scout clubs ever set up in the world were set up in South Africa. And my sons and even my grandson are involved now with the Boy Scouts. And it's amazing that Major Baden-Powell conceived the idea of the Boy Scouts to prepare boys in the Empire for military service, which is why later there were Sea Scouts and there were Air Scouts too. But of course, originally just thought the Boy Scouts, and then Baden-Powell's wife also launched the Girl Guides, and of course, out of that also the Brownies, and today you've also got the Cubs and you've got the Meerkats, all part of the Boy Scouts movement worldwide. And Baden-Powell said it was Frederick Burnham. He was the inspiration as the ideal for the Scouts, and he said he modelled the ideal Scout on Frederick Burnham, who was one of the great pioneer Scouts in the opening up of Rhodesia.
What was Baden-Powell's connection to Rhodesia?
Well, he was part of Cecil Rhodes's pioneers that he was using to open up the country. And interestingly, there's another funny story about Major Baden-Powell, who later became General Powell. But during the time of the Anglo-Boer War, he was Major Baden-Powell, and he was the commander of Mafeking, which was a strategic railway town that was besieged by the Boers. Well, on the Boer side was Commandant Kruger. He was a grandson of President Paul Kruger. President Paul Kruger had 17 children and 144 grandchildren. So you can imagine there would have been a lot of Krugers out there. But this Commandant Kruger, I can't remember his first name, one day came across with a white flag and saluted Major Baden-Powell, who saluted back and said, "Now, we don't fight on Sundays, so would you mind if our men came into town and joined you in your church services for Sunday morning worship?" And Baden-Powell said, "By all means." And so the Boers trekked in on a Sunday morning to join the British for worship in their Church of England or Methodist churches, the case may be. And then the ladies of the town invited the officers, "Would you like to join us for Sunday lunch?" And quite a lot of homes in Mafeking had Boer commandos with their bandoliers and their Mausers sitting at the dining room table. So in the afternoon, some of the British men said, "Would you like to join us for a game of cricket this afternoon?" So the Boers played the Brits cricket in the afternoon. And then the ladies came at the end of the cricket, said, "Next week we are wanting to have a ball in this town hall. Would you men like to start the ceasefire earlier on Saturday afternoon so that you could join us for the ball? We can do with some more men." And so the Boer men came in the next Saturday night and were dancing with the British ladies. And then they were worshipping with the British on the Sunday morning. Then they were having lunch in their homes and then having cricket in the afternoons. And this carried on for quite a while. It just speaks of another age, and it shows you also the chivalry that used to be possible when you had Christians on both sides. And my father even spoke of, in the Second World War, when he was in North Africa as one of the desert rats under Montgomery, that at Christmas they would have an automatic ceasefire and sing Christmas carols, and on Christmas Day play soccer and exchange ration packs. And he said after every battle there was an impromptu, understood ceasefire so that both sides would help with the wounded. And he said there would be a German Africa Corps carrying British wounded desert rats on stretchers to their lines. There'd be British medics caring for German Africa Corps men in no man's land. And there was this respect. In fact, my father said that he felt closer to Erwin Rommel and the Africa Corps than he did to his own people and his own government back in England. And he said the real enemy in North Africa was actually the desert. It was the heat, it was the thirst, it was the sandstorms, it was the lice and all the rest. And he said our families back home didn't understand. But the Germans in the Africa Corps, they understood. And we were often having more sympathy for our enemies and feeling more compassion from them than we would from our own families and governments back home. Well, we knew our governments didn't care. But just interesting that there was this kind of era to remind ourselves there was an age of chivalry. And a lot of Rhodesians epitomized this, and people like Baden-Powell, of course, knew about chivalry, which is what he tried to convey through the Boy Scout movement, which today millions follow. So Rhodesians have inspired the world through the Alan Quatermain character, through the Courtney character in the Wilbur Smith novels, through the Boy Scouts. So you can say Rhodesia has impacted the world in culture in many other ways too.
Now we turn to Prime Minister Ian Douglas Smith, who was the last Prime Minister of Rhodesia. I believe that you actually knew him.
Yes, I had the privilege of meeting him when he was Prime Minister. I was just 14 years old in Bulawayo. My father was secretary of Bulawayo Club, and we heard the Prime Minister's coming to visit the Bulawayo Club. So I was waiting outside, expecting to see something impressive. I mean, some kind of entourage or procession. I don't know what I had in mind. Maybe Buckingham Palace type of, Coldstream Guards or something like that. But we didn't do that stuff in Rhodesia, of course. But I expected something. And down the road came a beat-up old Peugeot 404. And white was the Prime Minister. And of course, I knew him instantly from news and from pictures and newspapers. And his pictures up on the wall in the Bulawayo Club, obviously. So he gets out the car, he strokes my cat, Tim, who's sitting on the wall, and smiled at me and walked up the stairs. I'm looking around, not a bodyguard, not an aide-de-camp, not a chauffeur. The Prime Minister was driving himself during the war, and when I got to meet him many a time after that, back in 1985, Ian Smith sent me a summons to come through to his daughter's home in Hout Bay. He'd heard about these Rhodesians doing crazy things in Mozambique, and he wanted a briefing. So I brought my photo albums and explained to him what we're up to. And Ian Smith sat down and started to explain to me how to infiltrate and exfiltrate Mozambique wisely, how to avoid enemy patrols, how to stay alive. And at first I thought, what's a politician telling me about behind enemy lines activities? But then, I'd forgotten, during the Second World War, he was shot down over Italy and spent 5 months behind enemy lines working with the partisans. And then he even walked across the Alps to get into France after D-Day to rejoin the Allied forces. Ian Smith actually said to me one of the most foolish things he ever did, aside from going back to Stratford train a second time round in Italy, which got him shot down, was taking his boots off in the Alps one night. He could never get his boots back on again. He said they just hardened and his foot could not contort itself into his boots again. So he's walking in socks, no boots, for the rest of his hikes through the Alps. Well, also, Ian Smith mentioned to me what's involved in parachuting out of a Spitfire, because, they didn't have ejector seats back then. So the protocol, if you are damaged and you've got to bail out, you've got to flip your plane upside down, release the canopy, unbuckle your seatbelts, fall upside down, free. And once you're free, deploy the parachute, pull the ripcord. And, that takes nerves of steel. And you can't practice that. How do you practice that? There was no practice. They knew the theory, but, at the moment, you just had to have nerves of steel and do it. And so Ian Smith, he actually crashed also in North Africa and got horribly buckled. As he said, they thought his back was broken, but in fact, it was only just buckled. And he always made jokes like that. He was very offhand. At one point, I said to Ian Smith, now, I've seen Bob Mugabe's parades. Bob Mugabe and the Silent Whalers, they called it. Every day that the dictator of Zimbabwe, Rob Mugabe, travelled to work, he would have 8 motorbike outriders. He'd have police vehicles in front, truckloads of gooks with rocket launchers and machine guns behind him, and he'd be in one of 2 stretch armoured Mercedes-Benzes with tinted windows. He didn't know which one he's in, and roaring through town at top speed, and every vehicle on both sides had to stop or they were shot. And there's even deaf people who got shot dead because they didn't pull to the side of the road because Mugabe's people were coming past. And yet Ian Smith is pictured cycling to work. I mean, he never did this sort of thing. And so I questioned him about this. Said, considering you meant to be the most hated man in Africa, which is what the newspapers called him at one time, considering that Robert Mugabe is meant to be the popular leader of the revolution, why do you think he needs so much security and why don't you have any? And Ian Smith said, I'm a lifelong Presbyterian. I fear God. Who else should I fear? I survived the Second World War. What do I need to be afraid of? And so he would sometimes chase his security away from Independence, which was the home of the Prime Minister in Rhodesia. There wouldn't be a policeman at the gate. There wouldn't be a cook in the kitchen. He said he and his wife couldn't bear having people fussing around him. And that's the kind of man he was. Ian Smith never really had security. His doors were often open. His gates were wide open. There's normally just a Rhodesian Ridgeback lying across the door. That would be the only security he'd have. So Ian Smith was quite an inspiring character, and I believe that he's the one head of state that I've come across who was a man of his word. He said what he meant what he said. He's a man of honor, a man of principle. Nobody could ever point to any corruption. He didn't get rich out of politics. He was a farmer who served his country as a statesman because he was seeing the need to save his country from British duplicity. And as Ian Smith put it so very well, we were never beaten by our enemies. We were betrayed by our friends.
The coming 11th of November will mark the 60th anniversary of the independence of Rhodesia. Where can listeners learn more about the history and heritage of Rhodesia?
Well, we've set up a website, www.flamelily.org.za. So flamelily.org.za, that's our website. And we have the Rosarian magazine. I edited it, put together quite a lot of wonderful pictures of Rhodesia's heritage. And in the latest one, we've got of a lot of the people we talk about, like Major Alan Wilson, and you can see the details and beautiful, inspiring pictures of the Shingani Patrol, David Livingston, and the Victoria Falls, and his original sketches and so on. So there's a lot of this in the latest Rosarian magazine that you can see free online. You'll be able to view it as a flip book, literally like a magazine online, full color. There'll also be an option to download it if you want to print out a hard copy. You can go to your local printer and get it done as a print on demand. So the Rosarian is one good source, the Flame Lily website. You can also find Flame Lily Foundation Cape of Good Hope Facebook page. I put lots of great pictures on there. At the Christian Liberty Bookshop, we've got signed books of the biography of Ian Smith, The Great Betrayal, and I think that's one of the best that you can get on the subject. I deal with Rhodesia in my book, also Frontline Behind Enemy Lines for Christ, which covers a whole lot more, of course, afterwards, but that's where it starts. Bill Bathman's also written in Going On his missions to Rhodesia and seeing about what was going on with the attacks on the civilians. You can get a good perspective from Reverend Bill Bathman, the Bible smuggler who spent 67 years as a missionary, mostly in Eastern Europe, his perspective on Rhodesia, and that's going on. And there's normally a whole lot of other good books on Rhodesia that you can also get, like A Martyr Speaks. That's available from christianlibertybooks.co.za.
Thank you, Dr. Hammond, for the fascinating insight into the colorful personalities and inspiring personalities from Rhodesia's history. In closing, I'd like to read from Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Thank you very much for joining us for From the Frontline. God bless and good night.